We're going to do a fireside chat when it's 85 degrees outside.
How do you feel?
Very nice.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Chris, thanks very much. Great to have you. And as always with current events, whenever you seem to speak, there's always something that's happened that's important in cybersecurity. But you're doing a tremendous job, and it's great to. Excited to have the conversation. I think for those of you who don't know, Chris was appointed to lead the National Programs and Protectorate Directorate for DHS in June. He may have a new role coming up soon, given the passage of the CISA legislation in the Senate last night. Still has a little bit more work to do, but he's had senior roles in the Bush administration as well as in the private sector. And I think everybody who's been following this issue, particularly for the last year and a half, knows that you've done tremendous work in the agency, a lot of efforts underway, a lot of leadership. We're fortunate to have you, and we have a lot of questions to ask. Thanks very much for being here. So just to start with what happened last night. So obviously it's still got to go back into the House because of some of the add-ons that happened in the House. But it passed the Senate, the CISA legislation. What does that mean for you when you look at your current efforts that are underway, but also for your future agenda if this agency ultimately passes?
So first and foremost, it means only about 4 more weeks do I have to go by the incomprehensible and unpronounceable National Protection and Programs Directorate.
I think I actually probably switched around.
You did. I've made a bad joke that it sounds like a Soviet-era military intelligence agency, NKVD, NPPD. It's pretty much the same. But first and foremost, it does just that. It clarifies and clearly signifies our mission. And so when I go out there and my team goes out there and engages stakeholders, principally the private sector critical infrastructure community, it makes the icebreaker that much easier. We don't have to explain what a Protection and Programs Directorate means. Instead, it's, hey, we're with DHS and we're the National Cybersecurity Agency, effectively. So it breaks that down immediately. It also is going to help significantly in terms of recruiting. There have been a number of job fairs where we've had signs that say DHS or National Protection Programs Directorate. Nobody knows what that means. So it'll actually make, just from a right out the gate recruiting perspective, make things easier. But probably most importantly, it streamlines the organization. So NPPD, when it was established in 2007, was almost like an island of misfit toys. It was a conglomeration of disparate programs, security programs within DHS that didn't neatly fit within TSA or FEMA or other established legacy agencies. It was more of kind of the emerging space. In addition to the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, which was quite small in 2007, both budgetary and resource and personnel-wise, it also included the Office of Infrastructure Protection, which was a bit of the big dog, and then the Office of Biometric Identity Management, then called US Visit, and then ultimately it also brought in the Federal Protective Service. So you had this suite of programs that if you step back you could look and you could say, yeah, they all fit together, but in terms of mission, they didn't actually directly align. So over time, as the threat landscape, particularly from a cybersecurity perspective, has evolved and the department's role has been clarified and strengthened by Congress, it really became clear that the department needed a single voice, a single agency or organization that was able to carry out the Secretary's critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity authorities. And that brings us to today. So the Office of Biometric Identity Management will shift over to the Office of Management. And then FPS, the Federal Protective Service, which guards and protects GSA leased and loaned facilities, there's a kind of an off-ramp or a transition process. All of these are critically important missions for the department and the broader security enterprise, but they're not core to the mission of CISA or CISA. So lots more to do in terms of transitioning and getting to fully operational capability. But you know, that one right out the gate, getting the name change is just so critical for the organization.
So as you look at some of the efforts that you're working on right now, and it's interesting because how will this translate into the new agency, but election security. So you've been focused on that arguably more than any other individual in government, both in the past as well as looking into the future for cybersecurity. Yesterday you talked about how the trust between the federal government and state and local government has improved significantly. and that you're looking at these elections as being the most secure elections in our nation's history. Can you talk a little bit about how trust facilitates security and who's doing it right at the state level? What have you seen that's effective that gives you hope for 2018?
Right. So in 2016, when the intelligence community got an understanding of what was going on and how the Russian intelligence agencies were attempting and actually in some cases infiltrated state election infrastructure, when you had that intelligence and the senior officials approached state officials at the time, first it took a while to figure out who to talk to. The concept that secretaries of state administered elections was not something that DHS or the intelligence community knew. There was an agency within the U.S. federal government that had a very deep understanding of that, and that's the Election Assistance Commission. The problem is no one in DHS knew that the Election Assistance Commission actually existed in and of itself. So there was a lot of, that old adage of emergency response or incident response. You don't want to be exchanging business cards at the incident zone or in the EOC. That was happening digitally, at least. So we've gotten past that. We understand the landscape and who the players are, and we've established partnership mechanisms, communication protocols, so that if now I have a piece of intelligence, actionable intelligence, I know who to go to in every single state. Whether it's the Secretary of State, a senior election official, the Homeland Security Advisor, the state CIO, and the governor, we know who to hit, and we can do it quickly, whether they have a clearance or not. If they have a clearance, great. If they don't, I can do one-day read-ins, or, you know what? One way or the other, we'll get it to them and we'll deal with the consequences on classification later.
So you said Island of Misfit Toys. You want to volunteer who was the Charlie in the box?
No comment.
That's what I thought.
Look, all of the missions, and I think Governor Ridge is well acquainted with how the department came together, but every one of the missions within DHS serves a critical purpose. What we need to do 15 years into the department is ensure that we're properly aligned across the mission space to achieve those security outcomes we want. And that's the primary objective of the CISA legislation.
So just in working on the legislation to create DHS, I will tell you that back in 2001, the intent and the threat landscape was so different than what it is right now. And when we were in the Senate and putting that together, there was no way we could have envisioned what the threat looks like today. And so even though it's only been 17 years, in history, that's not a very long period of time. If you look at the intent of that legislation and why we were bringing together the entities that we were, it's considerably different.
Build on that just for a second. Really, when I step back and I look at the significance of 2016 and the Russian efforts to interfere with the election, it was not just an awakening for the intelligence community. I think the American public actually, it was a galvanizing moment. I've said this before. Prior to that, my sense of things was that cybersecurity, if you're not a practitioner, if you're to the layperson, cybersecurity had been an intellectual property issue where the Chinese are stealing our good ideas, the North Koreans are smash and grabbing on banks, Russia's doing something over there, whatever it is. It had always been kind of this ephemeral, intangible threat. The 2016 elections, it was an awakening because it was the first time I think people actually realized that cybersecurity could destabilize our government. And it really shook people to the core. And as a result, what I've seen across the interagency with the intelligence community, the FBI, the State Department, all the players across the board have oriented towards that goal of we're not fighting amongst each other, we have a common adversary. And what's it going to take to align capabilities, resources to not just get it done as a federal government, but also support state and local governments?
So let's talk strategy. There's always been criticism that we don't have a strategy on cybersecurity. Well, today we have now the DHS strategy, we now have the DoD strategy, and we now have a new national cybersecurity strategy, which I think John Bolton is saying is the first one since 2002, 2003. Probably the most significant thing that I saw out of all these documents is the concept of defending forward, which is what DoD is talking about now. In effect, carrying the fight to the enemy a little bit sooner than we have in the past, not being as reactive. We've seen press reports that PBD 20 has now been superseded by NSPM 13. There's your government bureaucratic acronym moment for all of you. and that we are now in a position where DOD is going to go in and address threats that are happening from the source. So 2 questions for DHS on this. How do you guys play into that? How does it affect you? And what do you do with the private sector? Because I think one of the concerns has always been, a little bit overblown, but it's still there, that if the government's going to go in, the private sector needs to be notified of this to a certain degree and needs to understand the consequences if the adversary decides to respond either asymmetrically or just in a different sector altogether. How is the coordination mechanism going to work on that?
So when you step back and you look at the complete deterrence package across the federal government, there's a suite of options, both military but also diplomatic, financial, and that's from a cost imposition perspective. My team sits squarely in the deterrence by denial space. We look to work with the private sector to up the defenses. The problem is, when you live on a street of glass houses, yeah, we may have the biggest rocks, but we also have the biggest glass house. So how do we work with the private sector to make the house a little less glassy? One of the things we did over the course of the summer was announce the establishment of the National Risk Management Center. And what that was, in effect, was taking an existing organization within, or a subcomponent within NPPD, my team, that was kind of a back office risk analytics shop that took some demand signal and generated good analytic products. But the connectivity with the private sector wasn't necessarily what it needed to be. So we reoriented the agenda setting for this organization and boosted the resources to be more private sector informed. And that is consistent with the broader philosophy that I'm bringing to the organization is we're not doing anything, for the most part, without having a clear set of requirements established by the private sector and our critical infrastructure partners. Everything I do is voluntary. And the key to a voluntary partnership is you have to have partners on both sides. So for someone to work with me, they have to get value out of the engagement. So to define that value, we have to figure out what the requirements are, set a demand signal, align our capabilities against that demand signal, and ultimately pop out the other side, something of benefit to the private sector partner. So the National Risk Management Center, again, was that attempt to bring a storefront that private sector could come in through, and not from a specific piece of intelligence. I've got the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. Lots of centers, I get it. But the end kick is focused on defending today, taking care of the worms and the malware and all that good stuff that's burning across the globe right now. The National Risk Management Center is focused on tomorrow, securing tomorrow, figuring out what the strategic risks are to our critical infrastructure, and bringing together the groups and the partnerships that we need to ensure that the next deployment, whether it's the rollout of 5G or the next pipeline or whatever it is, has security baked in by design.
So when you look at the National Risk Management Center, what you've done is you've launched it with these 3 sectors, energy, telecom, and finance. How are you structuring this center in a way where, so we have the age-old problem where industry says, we're giving you this information, but what are we getting in return? So you're talking about looking at, okay, what's the intel that you're going to kick back out? What are you envisioning for that offering that government's going to provide? I know Intel Collection, and Bob Kolowski, who's running it, is talking about Intel Collection. That's my first question. My second question is, you took 3 legacy infrastructure sectors who, for all intents and purposes, are doing it right. I mean, they've modeled good behavior, whether it's CRISP at energy, all the financial infrastructure, what telecom is doing. Have you thought about bringing in those sectors that need a little bit more help? Because would they get more out of government, and would that balance actually help identify what government can offer?
So ultimately what we want to get to a lot, but my mentality with the shift in the Risk Management Center was a bit of a startup mentality. It wasn't fully baking the cake, taking a year to develop the strategy, the implementation plan, the objectives, goals, the charter, all of that stuff that was going to take a long time to do. And instead, let's start this up small with a core group of dedicated partners that want to lean in, that want to be co-located with us or us co-located with them, and start having some small scale but significant wins. Playing small ball, right? Singles and doubles, driving in runs, building confidence to launch to bigger success stories down the road. So we did start at the core with the tri-sector, energy, comms, and finance. But we also have other smaller scale, at the moment, projects that will lead into bigger things. We announced on Tuesday, yesterday, actually, morning, the Pipeline Security Initiative, working with pipeline and natural gas operators alongside the Department of Energy, Transportation Security Administration. It's providing focus, support, and intelligence to these efforts, again, to ensure the longer-term critical infrastructure space. Now, we're doing this through a series of sprints. We've got 3 or 4 sprints right out the gate, 90-day organization efforts. One of the sprints is actually just developing a charter for the organization and a governance model of how industry and government will work together. But also the Tri-Sector Working Group will kick off kind of a risk registry process. And that is, again, it's getting, you mentioned all these different sectors coming in. The 16-sector model under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan is a critical and important and useful organizing construct on how to work day-to-day issues with the sector. But at the same time, we have to be real with ourselves that there are some sectors that pose a greater degree of risk to our nation and our economy. So in the government, we have mission essential functions, those things that the government has to deliver on a daily basis to ensure our constitutional democracy carries forward. What we don't have, what are those equivalent functions that come out of industry? So that is one of the other sprints that we're working through the Risk Management Center is across the 16 sectors, what are those key functions? Some sectors will have more functions than others that industry has to deliver to ensure our economy keeps clicking and whirring. And the example I always bring up is in the financial services industry. It's not necessarily the ATMs and cash availability, but it is clearing wholesale payments at the end of the day. It's treasuries and pricing. It's those things that drive the global economy. So we've got to build this understanding of what risk really is across our infrastructure community. And in doing so, we have to move away from this model that a single infrastructure asset or a single institution or organization is the organizing concept. We've got to get to what the service delivery is and who makes that up. And in part, what we'll find is there are organizations that we probably didn't have the relationship or the engagement that we needed to have. And there will also be boutique and customized services and capabilities across that function.
So you talked about the NKIC, worrying about the here and now threat. And in some of your testimony, you've highlighted the threat to ICS, industrial control systems, and calling out the Russians, as you and others have done, about specifically doing strategic reconnaissance on infrastructure. Data destruction, I think, is now something that people understand in the aftermath of the Ukraine, and certainly with Saudi Arabia and Qatar a few years before that. How are you looking at that threat challenge right now, and what do you think needs to be done, A, to deal with what the Russians are doing on strategic reconnaissance, but B, how do we better strengthen our ICS infrastructure to make it more resilient to the current threat environment?
So in the operational technology or ICS space, I think the security conversation is I don't want to say a little bit behind where the IT space is, but it's just a different ecosystem and it's a different surface area. Maybe somebody thinks it is behind, but we'll come back to that. So where we're looking is getting a better understanding of how these threats work and how the access works. And so we spent a lot of time over the last several months working with the Department of Energy and some of the labs to understand what it looks like across the IT/OT domains, how adversaries are making hops and the sorts of things. It's really hard to actively monitor, at least from our capabilities right now, what's going on in the OT space just because of the fragility of it and the life safety implications. So we're working with, as I mentioned, the labs to get that better understanding and a number of the security companies. It is a smaller group. When you think about the actual ICS manufacturers, it is a much narrower set of stakeholders that are all forward-leaning and engaged. And we can work that through the Industrial Control Systems CERT that we host out of DHS, but also there are other players across the federal interagency. Last summer, when we first encountered and disclosed the Russian activities across ICS, we issued a number of alerts and then another one in the spring. I think it was a very unimaginative title, something like Russian activity across critical infrastructure. It was a technical alert. The interesting story is that it really was it was one of the better examples of how the adversary is not necessarily knocking on the front door. The Russians work the supply chain really, really well. NotPetya was another example with the infiltration of MEDoc. But they were working through suppliers and vendors to energy companies to get into the energy company networks. And so what is increasingly important is that we don't go back into a pre-9/11 siloed approach to intelligence and information sharing. We have to bring the total picture together. As soon as we got indicators out of the energy companies that we knew had some compromises, we were able to splash that out and send those alerts out, and it just lit up an entire campaign across about half the sectors: aviation, transportation, construction, and it just speaks to the need to fuse information. No single piece of information is too small. Let us stitch together the bigger common operating picture, the bigger mosaic of activity to get an understanding of what the adversary is doing, and we can work the problem a lot faster.
I know we're running out of time. Before Roger wraps up, I want to just kind of take that in a little bit of a different direction for a moment. So last year, you made an ISAC for elections, and so deeming the elections being critical. And you just talked about no piece of information not being unimportant, every piece of information being important. In light of that, and in light of the evolving threat environment, if we look at companies that are in social media, if you look at Facebook, if you look at others who are arguably having a greater impact in some ways on our national and economic security than we could anticipate, how are you starting to see critical infrastructure evolve? When Mark Zuckerberg came to the Senate in March, he talked about the R word. He talked about regulation. He said, we've got to work together. And there is a need here, right? When you talk about information, that company in particular, but there are others, are aggregating this information. It's coming through. Their business model was not developed to really work in national and economic security. What's the vision as technology companies like Facebook come down the pike for how to work with them and how to start to define this area of technology as being critical?
So a couple thoughts here. One is, everyone's now an IT company. Just the edges are blurring on what is a true IT company. We just launched earlier this week some technical alerts about managed service providers and how adversaries have compromised those managed service providers and able to hop into their customers and again, IP theft. But stepping back even further, I mentioned it earlier, I'm thinking about things through two lenses. One is defending today, the second is securing tomorrow. How do we take care of today's risk and security threats and to ensure that today we don't have issues, and then what does the future look like? So regulation is not something that I tend to have in my vocabulary right now because it's not my authority set. And if I've learned anything, I can't expect to ask for something legislatively and get it quickly. The name change is literally taken about 3 or 4 years. A name change. So let's say we can even get a legislative package through Congress. The regulatory process under the Administrative Procedures Act is going to take another 2 years. So we're talking about several years. But what we have to do is ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can as the federal government to enable private sector to defend itself, to protect itself from what we're increasingly calling a collective defense model. But to do that effectively, it does require the private sector to come forward. I'll go back to 2016 in the election hacking. That was a pivotal moment, not just for government, but for industry as well, an awakening. That it's no longer about cyber criminals or IP theft. It is a potentially existential threat to our country, to our infrastructure, to our government. And the shift in, or the increased willingness of organizations to come sit down with us, to sit down with the IC and DOD and figure this problem set out, I don't think I actually expected it to be as much vigor in these engagements as we're actually seeing right now.
And that's an encouraging sign. And another sign is we are out of time. I want to thank you, as always, for taking the time to speak with us. We thank you for your service. You're doing a great job at DHS. Continue to push the rock up the hill. Every day is a small incremental progress. But thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.